That was Dizzy Rascal, a request from Sam, who has been chiding me that I only play white men who play guitars. And that's absolutely true. Don't expect me to be so responsive to other requests, because white men with guitars is what I like. So today, I'm going to be talking to you about how Britons learnt to do democracy in the 19th century. And you can all thank Mimi. Where's Mimi? Mimi for being the stellar student and getting the prize today for reporting the broken link. So I know that Mimi is now well prepared to talk about Felix Holt. So yes, I'm going to talk to you about how Britons learned to do democracy. And I want to start by making the, in one sense, pretty obvious point, which is that it's in the period from the 1830s up to 1918 that Britain becomes a recognisably modern, develops a recognisably modern political system. That is to say, it has nationally organised mass politics, it has parliamentary parties competing for the votes of a mass electorate. Those parties have national organisations. There are regular elections held. Those elections are held by secret ballot. MPs are paid. The corruption of voters is eradicated and replaced, as we all know, those of us who live in modern political systems, by the corruption of their representatives. Universal manhood suffrage arrives, and eventually even the enfranchisement of women. So in many ways, this system in 1918 looks like the one that we currently vote under here. Different names of parties, but basically the same system. On the other hand, what I'm going to try and suggest to you today is that it's also a radically strange system that they have in the 19th century. A radically strange system, not just because that the development of a new system has to replace an older, more traditional one, but that there's a cross-fertilization between the modern and the traditional, which is, of course, one of the big themes of the class generally. So how is it radically different? Okay, give you some ideas for you to look out for the rest of the class. First of all, it's a politics that is conducted without a mass media. Okay? That is to say that politics remains highly localized in form throughout much of the 19th century. Even though you have a national newspaper press in the second half of the 19th century, most politics remains very, very local. It's also conducted primarily outside, out of doors. And it's often conducted in front of people, directly in front of people, in great big mass demonstrations, in meetings where you would listen to someone speak, not just for 20 minutes. This is not a rally on Sproul Plaza. These speeches often went on for 2 hours, sometimes even longer. I mean, you know, long orations, a little like one of my lectures when they get out of hand. And most importantly, the vote, because people had the vote, but that vote was seen to be not the possession of a particular individual, but was seen to be held on trust by that individual so that they could represent a broader community beyond themselves, whether it's their family, whether it's their trade, or whether it's a particular community. And lastly, the other very extraordinary part of this political system, as far as we're concerned now, is that it seemed perfectly legitimate, therefore, for people who didn't have the vote to be able to influence those who did. It would seem perfectly legitimate for those people who did have the vote to take bribes from those politicians seeking to win their support. Okay? And then finally, the last element, which it seems very strange to us, is that politics was a deeply unruly and often violent affair. Okay? It's not the type of sort of sanitized procedure that we now have when we go to vote, after an election, where you go into a house or into a public space and mark your little cross. It's full of noise, it's full of scuffles, and often nasty violence. Now, it's that system that comes under radical reform from the 1830s onwards. And what I'm going to suggest to you is that central to how Britons learned to do democracy in the way that we understand democracy today is that old politics gets sanitized, gets standardized. It gets standardized around the idea of the voter as being an individual who has to answer to no one other than himself, okay, because it was always a he. It becomes standardized around eradicating the forms of influence and interest that became designated as corruption. And it became standardized around drawing firm lines about who could participate and who could not participate in the electoral process. So I'm going to talk to you now then about just this process of the reforming of the electoral system. And I'm going to do so in two parts. Well, let me just, before I tell you how I'm going to do it, remember throughout this lecture, okay, that the Houses of Parliament that you see behind me here consist of two bodies, the House of Commons and the House of Lords. Okay? These are collectively known as the Houses of Parliament, but they're these two quite separate houses, like the Senate and the Congress. The difference is that the House of Lords was entirely unelected. You were there on a hereditary basis as a member of the peerage, the aristocracy. In contrast, the Commons was entirely elected. So when I'm talking about a process of election, in this lecture today, I'm going to focus entirely upon the election to members of Parliament to sit in the House of Commons. So I'm going to talk about this reform of the electoral system, but in order to do that, I have to first give you a potted guide to the system that existed before the reforms that began in the 1830s. And I'm going to do that by way of a series of very famous images. I'm going to turn the lights out. I mean, not completely out, but these are great pictures, and it would be well to see them. Is that too dark? No? Can you still see? These are a series of paintings produced by the famous satirical artist William Hogarth, which is Hogarth, in the 1750s, in the late 1750s. And one of the interesting things, I think, about the 18th and 19th century is actually the way in which elections and the political process themselves become the subject of artistic depiction. So you have people like George Eliot writing accounts of elections. You have Charles Dickens writing accounts of what elections feel like, just as you have William Hogarth painting these pictures. Now, even though this is a series of representations of the electoral process in the 1750s, I'm going to suggest to you that basically very similar forms continue to exist right down to the 1830s and beyond. So this first image is known as the treating, as the entertainment. So it's called the entertainment. Before any contest was declared, before any election was declared, the job of a member of Parliament or prospective candidate was to so-called treat his constituents, which basically we would understand now as being a form of bribery. That is to say that you would go buy them beer down at the pub, you would hold lavish dinners for them, and you would, donate money to local charities and to local institutions and so forth. Okay, so this idea of treating is seen to be a perfectly legitimate part of the political process, a way in which a candidate, if you like, applies for the favour of voters. The other thing that I want you to notice about this image is that, it's obviously a good 18th century feast, and there's much, rivalry and disorder going on. But critically, women and children are a vital part of this scene. Okay? And one of the things about the 18th century political process, the so-called unreformed electoral process, is that women and children are an integral part of it in a way that became increasingly not the case during the 19th century. So after the candidate had treated his constituents, he would then go out and do an initial canvass, and this image is called the canvass, an initial canvass to find out what his prospects were like in the election. This is basically an 18th century opinion poll. Okay? It's an approval rating. You go out, you talk to people, and you find out how likely they are going to be to vote for you. Now that's important because, with all this treating and buying of votes, elections could be a very expensive business. So you didn't want to go through the hassle of having to hold an election if you thought you didn't stand that much chance of getting elected. Very often, elections went uncontested as a result. Very often, something like 65% of elections during the 18th century were uncontested. There was no election actually held. The sitting member was simply returned because no challenger came up to try and challenge them at the poll. Now, note here in this image that where is this business taking place? Outside a public house, indeed. Outside a public house. Okay, the public houses were always the headquarters of candidates and of parties. Drink and alcohol were an essential lubricant for the entire political process. Remember here, you can't really see it, it's a little grainy, but here is a rival gang of the other party coming down to attack the headquarters of these people. Again, the point here is that the candidate is a supplicant for votes. Yeah? The candidate has to go around and please people and charm them and basically court their votes. If they did a good job at this, they got to the moment of actually staging a poll. Okay? And this is what voting looked like up until the 1870s in Britain. Okay? It took place in a public construction, a wooden construction put up just for the occasion of the election, in a prominent public place, and this was called the hustings. This edifice was called the hustings, and you would basically have to walk up these steps onto the hustings, declare yourself to the returning officer here, who would check to see whether you actually did have a vote, and then if you did have a vote, you declared publicly what your vote was. That is to say, everybody in the community gathered below the hustings, watching people vote, knew exactly the way in which you voted. Okay? And that was the point. The point was that you were held accountable by the community at large for how you cast your vote. Now, there's another extraordinary thing about voting, which is that you had two votes. You didn't just have one. Okay? You got to have two votes. And that meant that you could decide to split your votes between rival candidates. You didn't have to make a decision. You could say, oh, I like both these people, even if they seem to be on different political sides. Or you could, what was called plump, and just cast one vote. Okay? You cast one vote.